Welcome back to The Explainer. Today we're diving into what is honestly one of the greatest historical cross-examinations of all time. We're opening up St. Augustine's monumental text, City of God, to tackle a massive, enduring question. Why did Rome's morals actually collapse? Now, historians have debated this for centuries, but Augustine, he approaches it like a prosecuting attorney who's building an airtight case against a totally unexpected culprit.
You know how societies love a scapegoat during a crisis, right? Well, check out this ancient Roman proverb. Drought and Christianity go hand in hand. When things went wrong in ancient Rome, like when the rain stopped or the barbarians were literally knocking at the gates, the Roman masses pointed their fingers straight at the Christians. The popular claim was that by abandoning the ancient pagan gods, this brand new Christian religion was entirely to blame for all of Rome's miseries.
But Augustine absolutely wasn't buying it. So he flips the script. He frames his text like a brilliant historical detective story to ask a much deeper question. Who actually destroyed Rome's moral fabric? His argument is that the Roman Empire wasn't toppled by Christianity at all, or even primarily by outside invaders. No, he argues that Rome was destroyed by internal moral rot, long before a single Christian church was ever even built.
To really grasp this, we've got to introduce our prime suspects. Augustine gives a very specific and, frankly, pretty startling definition of the Roman pantheon. To your everyday traditional Roman, these gods were revered protectors, but to Augustine, they were literal demons. He saw them as malevolent spirits seeking worship through the absolute corruption of mankind. In his view, they weren't just indifferent to the citizens, they were actively malicious orchestrators of the city's downfall. They basically set up a system that was designed to fail.
Which brings us to the absolute core of Augustine's case, the missing moral code. Think about it. These so-called divine guardians issued zero laws guiding their followers to a virtuous life. They completely ignored the restraint of greed, impurity, or ambition. Instead, what did they actually demand? Bloody sacrifices and doleful rites. And here is the most insidious part of all this. If they ever actually had any good instructions, they whispered them in secret to a tiny elite, while loudly and publicly promoting vice to the masses.
So how exactly was all this vice promoted? Let's look at Exhibit A in Augustine's trial, the obscene stage. He points directly at the cultural institutions of Rome, specifically the theatrical plays. Now you have to remember, these weren't just ancient pop culture diversions or fun weekend entertainment. These were mandatory religious solemnities. The gods explicitly commanded and extorted that these plays be held in their honor. They basically wove entertainment and divine worship into one incredibly toxic package.
And what were these plays actually like? Well, just listen to how Augustine describes the festivals for Cynthia, the so-called mother of the gods. He writes, "The mother of the gods being such a character as the most profligate man would be ashamed to have for his mother." The plays dedicated to her purification were so shockingly obscene, filled with such lewd actions and filthy words, that even decent Roman citizens couldn't bear to hear them rehearsed in their own homes. It was essentially state-sponsored, divine reality TV at its absolute worst.
And the Roman hypocrisy here is just staggering, especially when you compare it to the Greeks. Plato famously banished poets from his ideal city to protect the citizens' minds from their corrupting fables. But look at the Roman reality. The Romans legally punished human actors, erasing them from their civic tribes and treating them like absolute outcasts just for performing. Yet at the exact same time, they built massive temples and offered lavish sacrifices to the very gods who demanded these obscene performances in the first place.
So what does this tell us? It tells us that human laws were actually greater than divine demands. Take the 12 Tables of Rome. That was their foundational legal code. It strictly punished citizens for slander. If you wrote a public satirical smear against a fellow Roman, that was a capital offense. Yet, the gods actively enjoyed and encouraged being slandered on stage by poets. Augustine really hammers home the point here that the Roman laws were vastly more moral and protective of human dignity than the deities they were worshipping.
Now, a defender of the Roman gods might jump in here and argue, well, the gods simply abandoned Rome because the citizens became wicked much later on, which leads Augustine to ask, did Rome's decay happen before or after Christianity? To answer this, he calls Rome's own greatest historians to the witness stand to establish exactly when the Republic truly fell apart. He's pulling the curtain back on the real timeline of their moral collapse.
Let's walk through the timeline laid out by the Roman historian Sallust. First, after the expulsion of the kings, you have a brief period of equity and good order. Second, during the Punic Wars, harmony was maintained, but really only out of a mutual fear of their huge rival, Carthage. Third comes the pivotal turning point, 146 BC, the destruction of Carthage.
Without an external enemy to fear, unprecedented moral decay just explodes. And fourth, entirely in the pre-Christian era, primitive manners were completely swept away by luxury, like a torrent.
To really cement this timeline, Augustine calls in a blockbuster witness, Cicero himself. Long before Christ was even born, Cicero wrote, "It is through our vices, and not by any mishap, that we retain only the name of a republic and have long since lost the reality." The republic was fundamentally dead from corruption during his own lifetime. Christianity didn't kill the republic. It was already a moral corpse centuries before Christianity ever arrived on the scene.
Okay, so if the gods weren't protecting Rome's morals, what were they actually doing? That brings us to our final piece of evidence, the gods behaving badly during the civil wars. Augustine points out that the gods didn't just sit back passively while this happened. They actively encouraged Romans to slaughter one another. Instead of acting as divine protectors of the peace, they operated as deliberate instigators of chaos and bloodshed.
I mean, these guys were literal instigators. They actively aided the ruthless Marius, helping him achieve 7 consulships despite his brutal massacres. They promised victory to the incredibly cruel dictator Sylla through favorable omens, like making a golden crown magically appear on a sacrificial liver. Did they offer any warnings to these leaders about their moral atrocities? Absolutely zero. They even went so far as to display phantom demonic armies fighting in the plains of Campania just to justify human civil war by a supernatural example. They were literally putting on an otherworldly warmongering show.
Which leads to this massive rhetorical question. If these gods were real guardians, why didn't they issue any moral laws? Why use their supernatural influence to promise military victories to tyrants, but never once demand purity, justice, or mercy? It really forces us to step back and ask what a culture actually values if its highest powers demand nothing good from it. The answer, according to all the evidence we've just walked through, is that they function solely to accelerate Rome's ruin.
And so, we finally arrive at the verdict. The collapse of Rome? It was an inside job. Rome's morals didn't collapse because they stopped worshiping the gods. Their morals collapsed precisely because their revered deities actively engineered a culture of vice. The Roman people were trapped in this impossible system where divine worship practically required their own moral degradation.
As we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with something to really chew on. Does a society actually fall to outside invaders, or does it collapse from within when its moral foundation crumbles? Augustine's unbelievably deep dive into Roman history shows us that long before the physical walls of Rome were ever breached, its moral bulwarks were completely leveled by the very culture it worshipped. Thank you so much for joining me today, and I really hope this leaves you eager to dig deeper into the true foundations of great empires. See you next time.